is a short paper, so that I'm expecting there to be actually quite a bit of time for questions after I've done my little presentation. So we're not going. I won't bore you for an hour. I'll try and keep it very short. This paper's in 3 parts, and the first part I'm going to talk about. I guess I described this as the underbelly of what Simon was talking about yesterday. So I'm going to do some reflection on intellectual output in the current period and in recent times. Part B, I'm going to move into some quasi-philosophical reflections about the nature of creation, what creation is, and then in the final part C of this paper, I'm going to come back and talk about the nature of the university, the current university, and some of its difficulties, shall we say. All right, in a number of recent books, I've pointed to the decline in high-level intellectual output that occurred in the era of the information age and the knowledge society. Now, I'm not going to repeat myself here. Rather, I will confine my observations principally to a particular example. And you see the fruits of that example on the slide that I've got up here. So in the next little period, I'm basically going to talk to this slide. One of the most influential fields in the humanities and social sciences in the 20th century was that of cultural theory. It incorporated works of many, arguably most of the prominent thinkers of the century, located outside of the natural sciences. Practically all of the great philosophers, sociologists and literary critics and theory-driven historians, economists and anthropologists of the century contributed to that field. Yet, like so many domains across the spectrum of human knowledge, the energy and productivity of cultural theory visibly waned in the latter decades of the 20th century. I take this, in a sense, to be a parable for what's happened across the universities in this period. The loss of energy and the decline of output and the corresponding decline per capita in the number of high-level works in the field is measurable and clear. To demonstrate this, I'm going to use here as a baseline a standard encyclopedic handbook of the cultural theory field, Ellis Cashmore and Chris Rojek's 1999 Dictionary of Cultural Theorists. The evidence from this dictionary is that the cultural theory field exhibits the kind of decline that others, including Michael Mandel in 2009 and Tyler Cohen in 2011, have observed dogging technology innovation across the latter decades of the 20th century and the first decade of the 21st century. What is indicated by all of this is that core intellectual production of the kind that embodies discovery at the highest level is quietly asphyxiating. Cashmore and Rojek's dictionary listed 618 major works by cultural theorists. The earliest work listed was from 1792, the most recent from 1998. Cultural theory as a field of inquiry was seeded in the 19th century, and 46 of the listed major works came from that era. The rest, 572, provide the principal data for what follows. Across the 20th century, we can analyse the number of major cultural theory works produced per decade as a function of the combined population size of the major countries responsible for cultural theory works across the century, namely the United States, the United Kingdom, France and Germany. The resulting data, and this is up on the table here, shows a rise in intellectual production per capita from the 1900s to the 1970s, and then a fall-off. The decline since the 1970s cannot be attributed to field-specific factors, as the domain of cultural theory draws from multiple disciplines. It is a litmus sign of energies across the humanities and social sciences. The peak of cultural theory output in the 20th century was 1973, which was quite a long time ago. A dictionary lists 16 major works that year. The second half of the 20th century was obsessed with questions of access to knowledge. The dominant ethos was that the more knowledge that was consumed, the better. But arguably, the bias towards consumption led to a diminution of interest in its production, or rather a confusion of the matter of the reproduction and distribution of knowledge with its original production, from which all other acts follow. The problem that we see illustrated here is a real one, and it is one that is not confined to cultural theory. It affects all the sciences, social and natural. Across the board, there is a long-term trend for the production of patents, copyrights, and high-level creations per capita, and I stress the word here, per capita, in the major intellectual capital states to decline, while expenditure to produce these has inversely increased. For many of the 60 years prior to 2008, OECD countries spent ever larger percentages of their gross domestic product on funding university and industry research, whether directly or indirectly, and whether by state or private means. Yet, the long-term outcome of this was incrementally diminishing returns on the investment and less high-calibre work per capita. One simple example will suffice to illustrate. Insulin, the drug to manage type 1 diabetes, was serially discovered in work from 1916 through 1923. Despite billions of dollars of research, nothing comparable in the management or the conceptual understanding of the mechanics of the condition has been forthcoming since. This type of story repeats too often across the arts and sciences to allay the nagging concern that there is a problem. A decade ago, the economist Diane Coyle observed what was happening to pharmaceutical companies. Let me quote from Coyle here. She said, "The drug companies spend a fortune trying to create new products, and some tempting rewards await their success. Yet, the pace of pharmaceutical innovation is disappointing. The evidence suggests a decreasing number of new products per $150 million spent on research and development." End of quote. In other words, heavily invested in research fields that should generate breakthroughs do not. Research yields minor increments, it fills gaps, much of it is prosaic, and quite a bit of it is junk. Which then leads me to part B of my paper today. All of this begs a larger question. What is it that drives high-level intellectual production? The answer, briefly, is that such production interpolates the act of creation, which then begs the further question, what is creation? I'm going to answer that question by saying that creation is the connecting of things that are distant and that seem at first glance to have no connection, which is actually quite a difficult thing to do if you think about it. Creation finds similarity in difference. It marries incongruity and unites unlikely pairs. How does it do this? Well, I'm going to argue for the purposes of this paper that it does so through the medium of form, pattern and shape. At the deepest level, creation of all kinds, the scientific and technological, the social and the industrial, as much as the artistic, is aesthetic in nature. Form is what unites by dividing, and in demarcating and dividing the world, it unites it. All form, pattern and shape is defined by the line. The line, in every case, establishes a limit. And the limit is what unites beginning and end, inside and outside, old and new, near and far. In short, in the moment of creation, everything becomes its opposite. The oldest limit is the terrestrial horizon. It unites the known and the unknown. In the act of creation, such unions of opposites are achieved by aesthetic qualities, by media of creation such as proportion, ratio, rhythm and harmony. These qualities pervade human existence. Whenever we encounter the shapely limit, we are lifted up. The human species is a species that is capable of populating its world with shapely, patterned objects. That world of made objects, in fact, is the human world. And the more often it is that we posit such objects, the closer it is that we approach the condition of art. And whatever we posit in so doing stimulates further and later acts of creation, propelling us upward in a spiral of conception and invention. Now, echoing this, the University of Chicago psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi highlighted the importance of inspiring environments to human creativity. In this, he stands in an intellectual tradition that begins with the philosopher William James, followed soon by John Dewey and George Herbert Mead. James stressed the importance of the social environment in explaining the functioning of the human mind. In this model, learning and making, pedagogy and creation are all stirred up and motivated by the encounter of the human being with the human ecology. Csikszentmihalyi emphasised human vistas and built environments that generate magical atmospheres, those physical environments that deeply affect human thoughts and feelings. It is in beautiful settings, he observed, that minds are more likely to find new connections among ideas and new perspectives on issues. There is a compelling reason then why the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche worked in Switzerland's Engadine Valley and the composer Richard Wagner wrote music in a villa in Ravelot overlooking the Tyrrhenian Sea. The proposition is not that the environment creates the ideas, but rather that the encounter of the mind with the environment, the subject with the object, is what matters. Beautiful environments stimulate by providing models of suggestive order that feed back into human neurology to shape the unexpected but interesting neural pathways that lie at the root of human creation. As human beings, what we have made, from the landscape vista to the beautiful villa, makes us capable in turn of making the object world that feeds into the subject world of the creator. This is the circle or spiral of creation. The philosopher Barry Allen argues that human neurology depends on the artefacts that we posit. Now, this is quite unlike animal neurology. As is well known, among the hominids, the human species was distinguished by the enlargement of its brain. This offered Homo sapiens the facility of billions of additional neural connections. But to make those additional connections useful, they had to be ordered. The many additional possible pathways needed models of architectonic structure. And that was provided extragenetically by human artefacts and built environments. The plastic world that human beings create for themselves, eccentrically, as Helmut Plessner, the philosophical anthropologist, put it so beautifully, is a key source of the neural order, organisation and coherence. It provides the significance, that is, the structure of meaning, which underpins human knowledge and its being in the world. The better that plastic order is, that is to say, the more beautiful it is, the better are the neural structures that process the information engendered by the infinite multitude of experiences that human beings have. Experiences are only good if they can be translated into coherent experience, that is, into meaning. And that requires order and structure, and the object world that human beings make acts back upon them to provide that essential source of neural order. The object world of human making reaches its peak in aesthetic objects. Thus, it is not surprising that the earliest human tools were as much aesthetic creations as they were utilities. There is a circle that unites making, knowing, order, and aesthetics. Knowledge, in short, is an objectivation. And I remind you again of the quote from Hegel that Michael had at the beginning of his lecture slides yesterday. Knowledge, in short, is an objectivation. This is so because the human mind can form an immense array of possible neurological connections, but as a consequence it confronts the conundrum of form. It needs a shaping agent outside the mind to kick-start, that is, to stimulate and initiate the identification and ordering of such connections. The most powerful neurological links are not random, but rather are coherent. To solve problems, though, these links cannot simply repeat what exists. Instead, they have to form patterns of connection that are, in certain respects, unusual and unexpected. Creation unites the familiar and the strange. When neurological coherence and surprise combine, the mind advances. But what is it that unites them? The simplest answer to this question is an object world that is beautiful. Which then leads me to part C in the final part of this paper, which is entitled The Ugly University. You may have a hint of where I'm going. In fact, I really don't need to say any more. Just look at the pictures, I say. Okay? Now you understand where we have arrived, from whence we have come and where we have arrived. It's a sad story. As I suggested at the beginning of this paper, the second half of the 20th century struggled to meet its own aspirations to create. At no other time in human history has there been such a volume of rhetoric about creativity. Let me prove this empirically, okay? We like a good set of numbers. We have pictures and we have numbers. It's good combination. Oh, I get some more pictures. I'll just let you have a look at this. Just contemplate this for a little while. And just contemplate this while you're contemplating these wonderful creations. Just think about it in terms of what I said in my midsection part B about human creation and what is required for human creation. All right. No need to dwell on these pictures because we've all lived the reality. Everybody's lived the reality? I'm sure we have. Yeah. Okay. Let's we will come back and I will address that question I'm delighted to address that question. I look forward to it. So we've got the first question. Many more to come, I'm sure. As I suggested at the beginning of this paper, the second half of the 20th century struggled to meet its own aspirations to create. At no other time in human history has there been such a volume of rhetoric about creativity. The term creativity was salient enough by 1950 to begin to appear regularly in book titles. Of the books listed in the Harvard University Hollis catalogue and published in New York, the 1950s, 8 used creativity as a title word. Thereafter, the use increases through the 1960s to 38, the 1970s to 43, the 1980s to 51, ballooning in the 1990s to 107, and in the first decade of the 21st century, look, we've reached 236, aren't we good? Yet, this was no Renaissance period, far from it. This was also the era when the university grew so large that it came to overshadow all other institutions of creation. A number of universities proliferated, as did their size. Yet their contribution to human creation did not burgeon nearly to the same degree. If we measure high-level creation against the number of academic staff in the late 20th century university, the university contribution to human creation measured in real per capita terms shrank. More, it turned out, generated less. More staff, more resources and more campuses did not inspire greater, larger, deeper or more edifying creation. There are, of course, many factors that explain this. And I want to stress this. Creation is not a function of a single factor, even though I'm going to finish this paper talking about a single factor. What can I say? Time is short, life is short. That said, one, and I stress this, one of the causes of creation being strangled right in smack in the middle of the obsessive social chatter about creation was the often pitiful ecology of the mass university. Perhaps not in every case, but in most cases the built environment of the post-1960s university was ugly. And yes, I'm perfectly happy to debate this question. It started with brutalist and third-rate modernist architectural styles of many 1960s campuses, and it evolved through eclectic, slapdash, vulgar, cheap, gimmicky and thoughtless architecture. Hardly any of the campus architecture of the new universities built between 1960 and 2010 was memorable or even good. Campus landscaping was often no better and generally worse. Many of the older, principally 19th century universities suffered aesthetic decline as ugly new tower buildings began to blot their landscape and cheap fit-outs multiplied. Notably noisy air conditioning systems that made listening in lectures, let alone high-flown contemplation, a chore. For more than 2,000 years, it has been known that peace and quiet are essential to thinking. Late 20th century universities violated this fundamental premise of learning by introducing poorly sound-rated air conditioning everywhere. Universities were subject to intense public policy pressure to get as many students as possible enrolled, yet without governments having to pay the full and in practice the unsustainable price of this. Now, beauty, I would argue, is a recurring characteristic of the campuses of the world's best universities. If this is not universal, it is at least commonplace. Such beauty is in part a function of the available resources to spend, but this is so only in part. For having the resources to spend is a reflection of performance, and the performance of universities, being intellectual in nature, is a function of their aesthetic ecology to the extent that the mind is objectivated in the external world. The products of the creative mind have a life outside the mind that creates them. And those products conversely influence the course of future creation. The specifics of aesthetic ecology vary from country to country. The Chinese aesthetic is different from the American one, and so on. But in each case, this ecology is an important component in the causal circle of performance, resources, beauty that attracts the talent that completes the circle. Elegant economy in performance, efficient economies of resourcing, and the proportionate economy of beauty all amount to the same thing in the end. Each translates into the other, and each is mirrored in and egged on by the aesthetic ecology that houses them, and the talent that masters them and imbibes them. A case in point is Stanford University in California. It's one of the most beautiful campuses in the world. The campus was designed in the late 1880s by the great landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted and by the architect Charles Allerton Coolidge, who had been trained by Henry Hobson Richardson, one of the great 19th century American architects. Stanford University is also one of the principal crucibles, perhaps the principal crucible, of America's information and communication technology industry. It has been the seedbed of a who's who of major IT companies ranging from Hewlett-Packard, Google, Cisco Systems, Yahoo and LinkedIn to Sun Microsoft Systems, Netscape, Rambus, Averion Associates and Silicon Graphics, to name just a few. In 1950, Stanford University was a good but not a great university. Frederick Terman, the university's provost, changed that. He managed what almost no one else has done. He hoisted Stanford up a very slippery pole into the top rank of American universities, dominated by a group of institutions that had come to prominence in the halcyon days of American university building between 1880 and 1910. The times conspired with Terman. The era spanning 1950 to 1980 was California's golden age. You might notice today that golden age is well and truly in the past. California's infrastructure expanded in startling ways, amongst other reasons because America's military heavily relocated to the West Coast. Money, funding, contracts followed, aiding Terman's recruiting savvy. But human beings are not just economic or institutional actors, and neither are they just status creatures. They are also aesthetic beings. The aesthetic motive, the chance to work in great surroundings, is inestimable. Accordingly, the promise of Olmsted and Coolidge's vision was finally fulfilled in Terman's time. It's perfectly true that an aesthetic ecology without talent to occupy it is useless. But equally, talent without the inspiration of the object world struggles. What the beauty of the object world does is to communicate two interrelated things that are central to creation. One is limits, the other is shape. At its core, beauty is the beauty of line and form. The human sense of world building and the objectivation of things rely on the correlated human sense that the world not only is open, but also that it is limited. Objects emerge first as shapes, as outlines with boundaries. We create by giving form to things, and we learn to do this by observing the harmony, the order, and the arrangement of objects around us. The great public architecture of a superlative campus gives those who inhabit it and who pass through it a continuous education in form, shape and pattern. This education is not hectoring or moralising. It is simply there, almost beneath consciousness. At the same time, it incites, stimulates and encourages us to experiment with our own little constructions. It doesn't matter whether these are built form or engineering form or whether they are the shapes of words, books, databases or machines. They are all architectures in their own ways. From the large public scale of the campus to the small scale of the domestic apartment, a translation of inspiration is undertaken. Such translations end in the kind of garage experiments that made American information technology in its heyday great. Its heyday also, I have to say, is past. Most of these experiments, of course, fail. That is part and parcel of the nature of creation. Yet some experiments do succeed. They succeed when the sense of openness, the freedom to try things, is matched by a spark, an intuition, a hint or glimmer of a method of arranging things that is an advent which is nevertheless venerable. Its newness echoes age-old ways of putting things together. It is just one more new order of the ages, one more novus ordo seclorum. Thank you.